the skeleton of the world. Look at modern Rome, and you see a city bursting with the energy of 3 million people. It is a dense, unbroken sea of warm terracotta roofs, Baroque domes, and relentless, chaotic motion. It feels eternal. It feels as though the pulse of the Roman Empire never truly stopped, but merely evolved into the modern Italian capital. But this unbroken continuity is an illusion. If you stood on this exact ground in the 8th century, the silence would terrify you. Between the years 600 and 900 AD, Rome was not a metropolis. It was a corpse. The capital of the world, which once housed over 1 million citizens, had suffered an apocalyptic demographic collapse. By the early Middle Ages, fewer than 30,000 people inhabited a walled enclosure designed for 1 million. They lived in the decaying skeleton of a forgotten superpower. Today, we are going to walk through the darkest, most mysterious centuries of Rome's history. We will uncover who these survivors were, how they forged a living among the colossal ruins, and how the physical geography of the city radically shifted from a global imperial capital to a haunted, medieval frontier town. The Disabitato urban layout and geography. To understand Rome in the period between 600 and 900 AD, you must understand a concept the Italians call the Disabitato, the uninhabited zone. The physical boundaries of the city were still defined by the Aurelian walls, an immense, 19-kilometer circuit of brick and concrete defense towers. But the people of the early medieval period could not possibly fill this space. Following the Gothic wars of the 6th century, the devastating plague of Justinian, and the severing of the great aqueducts, the population plummeted. Without the aqueducts to pump millions of gallons of water up to the hills, the famous 7 hills of Rome were entirely abandoned. The sprawling imperial palaces on the Palatine Hill became haunted, crumbling ruins, slowly reclaimed by nature. The wealthy patrician villas on the Aventine and Esquiline hills were replaced by wild forests, vineyards, and malaria-infested swamps. The remaining population of perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 people had no choice but to migrate down into the lowest, most flood-prone section of the city, the Campus Martius, directly adjacent to a sharp bend in the Tiber River. They clustered here because they had to drink from the river, and they relied on the river to power floating watermills to grind their grain. Rome in 800 AD was not a contiguous city. It was an archipelago. It consisted of small, isolated villages and fortified monastic complexes separated by miles of empty, overgrown ruins, all contained within the absurdly large perimeter of the ancient walls. A visitor could walk for an hour inside the gates of Rome and see nothing but sheep, ruins, and trees before encountering a single human being. Parasites and preservation architecture. The survivors of this era did not build great monuments. They were parasites living inside the shell of a dead leviathan. The architectural reality of Rome from 600 to 900 AD is defined by a process known as spolia, the repurposing of ancient building materials. The medieval Romans possessed neither the engineering knowledge nor the vast economic resources required to quarry and transport new stone. Instead, the ancient city became the largest free quarry on earth. When a wall or a small church needed to be built, laborers simply dismantled a crumbling bathhouse or a pagan temple. Marble columns were dragged away. Bronze statues were melted down to forge crude weapons or church bells. But many monuments were too massive to dismantle, so they were repurposed. The ancient public entertainment venues, with their thick walls and easily defensible shapes, were highly prized. The arches of the Colosseum and the Theater of Marcellus were bricked up and converted into makeshift fortresses and apartment complexes for the emerging feudal aristocracy. However, there was one surefire way for ancient Roman building to survive this era intact: conversion into a Christian church. The most spectacular example of this is the Pantheon. Originally built as a temple to all the pagan gods, it was facing the same slow destruction as the rest of the city until the year 609 AD, when the Byzantine Emperor Phocas officially gifted it to Pope Boniface IV. The Pope consecrated the Pantheon as the Church of Santa Maria ad Martyrs. By officially dedicating the building to Christian worship, it was protected by papal decree from being stripped for materials. This pragmatic marriage of ancient imperial concrete and medieval Christian theology is the only reason the pantheon survives to the modern day. The ghost population society and classes who actually lived in this fractured, ruin-strewn landscape. The society of Rome between 600 and 900 AD was radically simplified from its imperial peak. The vast, literate middle class of ancient Rome, the lawyers, the clerks, the international merchants had vanished. In their place emerged a highly polarized, feudal society. At the bottom were the plebs, the commoners. These were agrarian workers, laborers, and artisans. They did not identify as citizens of a global empire. Their world was entirely localized. They identified with their specific neighborhood or parish. Their survival was precarious, dictated by the floods of the Tiber and the threat of malaria from the undrained swamps inside the city walls. At the top of the social hierarchy were the great aristocratic families and the high-ranking clergy. As central imperial authority evaporated, these elite families stepped into the power vacuum. They essentially functioned as warlords. Families like the Theophylacti began to seize control of vital resources, fortifying the ancient ruins to protect themselves from rival families and foreign invaders. Between these two extremes existed a unique, local military class known as the Exercitus Romanus. Originally formed from the remnants of the Byzantine garrison stationed in the city, by the 8th century, it had evolved into a localized militia made up of Roman landowners. They were responsible for defending the city walls, and they wielded significant political power, often clashing violently with the clergy over the election of the Pope, plowing the forum's economy and daily life. The economy of Rome during these 3 centuries experienced a catastrophic regression. In 100 AD, Rome survived on the Annona, the massive state-sponsored grain fleet that imported hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat from Egypt and North Africa. By 700 AD, the global supply chain was dead. The Mediterranean Sea was highly dangerous, contested by Byzantine fleets and expanding Islamic navies. Rome had to feed itself. Consequently, the city became overwhelmingly agricultural. The great public squares of antiquity were repurposed for survival. The Roman Forum, once the political center of the known world, slowly filled with silt and debris. It was rebranded as the Campo Vicino, the cow pasture. Medieval Romans literally plowed the earth above the buried temples to plant crops and graze their livestock. Trade was localized and barter-based. There was a desperate shortage of precious metals, meaning the complex, monetized economy of the empire had collapsed. People traded raw wool, cheese, and vegetables for handmade tools or essential services. To prevent mass starvation, the administrative burden of welfare shifted entirely from the secular state to the church. The papacy established a network of diaconii church-run welfare centers distributed throughout the city. Monasteries became the primary economic engines of Rome. They managed vast agricultural estates outside the city walls, known as domusculti, created specifically by popes like Hadrian to secure a reliable food supply for the urban poor. The church was no longer just a spiritual authority, it was the only functional administrative state left in the city. The rise of the Pope's politics and power. The political reality of Rome from 600 to 900 AD is the story of a dramatic pivot. It is the story of Rome severing its ties to the ancient Roman Empire in the east, and forging a new destiny with the barbarian kingdoms of the west. In the 7th century, Rome was officially a duchy of the Byzantine Empire, ruled from Constantinople. A Byzantine duke resided on the Palatine Hill, representing an emperor who was thousands of miles away and entirely distracted by wars with the Persians and the Arabs. When the Germanic Lombards invaded Italy and threatened to wipe Rome off the map, the Byzantine Empire provided virtually no military help. The popes realized they were on their own. Figures like Pope Gregory the Great in the early 600s had to step in and act as secular rulers, paying the army, maintaining the walls, and negotiating treaties with barbarian kings. By the mid-8th century, the papacy made a monumental geopolitical calculation. Pope Stephen II officially broke away from the Byzantine sphere of influence and traveled north across the Alps to forge an alliance with the rising power of the Franks. In exchange for crowning Pepin the Short as king of the Franks, the Frankish army descended into Italy, defeated the Lombards, and granted the Pope direct political control over a vast swath of central Italy. This alliance culminated on Christmas Day in the year 800 AD, when Pope Leo III crowned the Frankish king Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor. It was a staggering political theater. The Pope, the bishop of a ruined, impoverished city, claimed the supreme authority to create an emperor. This single act transferred the political center of gravity from the Mediterranean to northern Europe, and permanently established the popes as sovereign monarchs, laying the foundation for the papal states that would exist for the next 1,000 years. The economy of salvation, religion, and pilgrimage. While Rome had lost its secular empire, it retained a monopoly over something arguably more powerful in the early Middle Ages: salvation. Between 600 and 900 AD, Rome transformed into the ultimate pilgrimage destination of the Western world. To a Christian in Frankish Gaul or Anglo-Saxon Britain, Rome was the threshold of heaven. It held the tombs of the apostles Peter and Paul, and the earth was saturated with the blood of thousands of early Christian martyrs. Relics, the physical remains of saints, became the ultimate currency. Originally, the martyrs were buried in the catacombs outside the city walls. But as the surrounding countryside became increasingly dangerous due to raids, the popes ordered the mass translation of thousands of skeletons into the city. Cartloads of bones were brought inside the walls and distributed among the local churches, turning the entire city into a massive, fortified reliquary. This spiritual economy brought desperate wealth to the city. Kings, nobles, and commoners walked thousands of miles to pray at these shrines, bringing silver, gold, and foreign currency. To accommodate this massive influx of religious tourists, specialized foreign neighborhoods developed around St. Peter's Basilica. These were called the Scoli. There was the Scola Francorum for the Franks, the Scola Frisionum for the Frisians, and the Scola Saxonum for the Anglo-Saxons, which gives its name to the modern Roman neighborhood of Borgo. Rome was a geopolitical ghost town, but spiritually, it remained the capital of the world, the terror from the sea defense and the Leonine Wall. However, wealth accumulated in a ruined, poorly defended city inevitably attracts wolves. For centuries, the primary threat to Rome had been Germanic tribes from the north. But in the 9th century, a new, terrifying threat arrived from the sea. In the year 846 AD, a fleet of Aghlabid Arab raiders, referred to in local texts as Saracens, sailed from North Africa, landed at Ostia, and marched directly on Rome. The Roman militia successfully defended the Aurelian walls, keeping the core of the city safe. But there was a catastrophic vulnerability. The two most sacred and wealthiest sites in Christendom, the Basilica of St. Peter and the Basilica of St. Paul, were located outside the ancient defensive walls. The Saracens pillaged both shrines with impunity. They stripped the gold and silver from the altars, desecrated the tombs of the apostles, and retreated to their ships with unimaginable wealth, leaving the Christian world in a state of profound shock and humiliation. This traumatic event forced the papacy into immediate military action. Pope Leo IV realized that God alone would not protect the apostles. He commissioned the construction of a massive, heavily fortified wall to entirely enclose the Vatican Hill and St. Peter's Basilica, completed in 852 AD and built largely by captive Saracen labor and local militias. This new defensive circuit became known as the Leonine Wall. It essentially created a second, separate fortified city adjacent to Rome, known as the Leonine City. This massive architectural response to a brutal raid permanently altered the geography of Rome, defining the physical borders of what we know today as the Vatican City, the soil of resilient Cetide. The Rome of the Dark Ages is incredibly difficult to find. The timber houses rotted away centuries ago. The muddy paths of the Disabitato have been swallowed by the immense urban expansion of the 19th and 20th centuries. The popes of the Renaissance were so desperate to return Rome to its imperial glory that they cleared away much of the medieval architecture, preferring to showcase the classical ruins beneath. But it was during these 3 brutal, dark, and desperate centuries that Rome's survival was actually secured. The Rome of 100 AD was a city built on the plunder of a global empire. When that empire vanished, the city should have vanished with it, as so many other ancient capitals did. But it didn't. The 30,000 survivors who huddled in the ruins, who plowed the Roman Forum, and who repurposed pagan temples into Christian churches, refused to let the city die. They adapted. They traded global dominance for spiritual supremacy. They used the bones of the old world to construct the foundations of the new. When you walk the streets of Rome today, you are not just walking through the legacy of Caesar or Augustus. You are walking over the resilience of the forgotten medieval peasants, monks, and militias who lived in the ruins, who guarded the walls in the dark, and who kept the eternal city alive just long enough for the light to return.